We're now ready to test our user API endpoints. So the first thing that we should do is create a new test file for testing these. So let's go touch, tests, unit, server, and we'll call this one user.test.js. And let's now go ahead and open that. And what we're going to do actually is open the item test file as well. And I'm going to copy all the required modules at the top. I'm going to paste them into the user test file because we're going to be using most of these in this file as well. We need to make a few alterations though. The first one being that we want to get the user model here and not the item model. And also we're interested in the seed users object and the populate users function here as well. And lastly, in the before each hook, we want to pass in the populate users method here. So that's going to ensure that we clear our database before each test and that we've got some seed user data to work with as well. Okay, let's begin by creating tests for the get users endpoint. So the first thing we're going to do is create a new describe block, and we're going to pass in a string get users here, and of course the second argument will be a function. In the body of that function we can go ahead and call it to create our first test, and the name of that one will be should return user if authenticated. So the idea behind this first test is we should get the user and a 200 status if we supply a valid token to the get users endpoint. So that's why we created a seed user with a valid token, by the way, so that we've got one to work with in this test. Alright, so we should also define a function here. It's going to be an async function. And alright, we're ready to go. So inside the function, let's create a const res, and we're going to await the output from request and passing in our server into supertest like that. Now to call this route, we're going to call the get method, and we're going to pass in the user's path there like that. Next, what we need to do is set the authorization header on the request. Now to set a header with supertest, we can use the set method, and this one is very similar to the headers method in Express that we use in our controller. So the first argument is going to be the header name, which is authorization. And the second argument, we're going to create a template literal, put in bearer there, and obviously we need to pass in the token now. So before we make the request to supertest, let's go ahead and get a token. Actually, we don't need to do that. What we can do is we can pass it straight into here, and we can use, remember our first seed user has a valid token, so we can just go seed users 0 for the index, and then we can just go .token, so that should work. Alright, with the header set, what we want to do now is we can expect a 200 status, and now we can make an assertion. So let's firstly assert that the right user was actually returned, because remember with this endpoint, looking over here in Postman, you get the user object back, and you should get all the user's ID, name, and email inside that object. So let's go ahead and expect in the result object, it's going to be the body of the result object, and then so we get that user object, and let's just check that the ID is the same as the one from that seed user. So we'll go seed seed users 0._id, and don't forget to put to hex string like that. Actually, let me just close that menu to give us some more room here. Okay, I think that's done. So let's go ahead and run our test suite now. npm run test unit server. As you can see, our should return user if authenticated test is passing, so we're good to move on. Now, it's also critical functionality that an invalid authorization header or no authorization header does not give the user access to the resource. So we need to test for that as well. So let's create a second test under this one. And we'll name this one should return 401 if unauthenticated. All right. Now again, we'll create an async function. And for the body, let's just go ahead and copy this first test since it's roughly the same sort of outline. And we'll make a couple of alterations. Firstly, we want to remove this call to set here because we don't want a header. And we're going to expect a 401. And down here where we're checking to see if the ID in the user object is matching, let's just get rid of the ID part. And essentially what we want to do is just ensure that that user property that we get back, we want to check that that is not there. So we can make an assertion to be undefined like that. So let's go to the terminal again and run our tests. Now we can see that our new test should return 401 if unauthenticated is passing, and we've got 8 passing tests. Let's now create some tests for our registration route, which is post users. So we'll begin by creating another describe block down here, and we pass in a string post users, of course. Create a function for our tests. Now, let's call it, and the first test we're going to create is going to be called should create a user. And we'll pass in an async function to define the test. Now for this test, we're going to make sure that providing valid data to the post users endpoint will successfully create a new user. So we're going to expect to see that see the user data returned in the response body. Plus, we're going to check the database and make sure that a new user has been created as well. To begin with, we're going to create a new user for our test, and to make it easier, let's just go ahead and copy one of these seed users that we created. And I'm just going to create a const now, user, and I'm going to go ahead and paste that there like that. We get rid of the ID because we don't need that, but we will have to use the faker library over here. So again, I'm just going to copy the require call up here and paste it there like that. So now we've got a user object, and so let's go ahead and create a const res and await the output of super test request. And of course this is a post request, so we're going to call post, and the endpoint is the route is users like that. Then what we're going to do on the next line is send the user object. And for this one, we can expect a 200 status. Now we can make some assertions about the response. So let's firstly expect that res.headers.authorization we'll use the to be defined assertion. So basically what we're doing there is asserting that there's an authorization header in the response. Next, let's check at least one property on the body of the result. So you remember from post users, over here in Postman, you can see that what we normally get is an object with the user property and then the new user's properties inside that. So probably the easiest thing to do is just go expect res.body.user, and we'll just check the email. Let's just make sure that that's the same as the email of this user object that we've created up here. Now we also want to check the database because we want to ensure that our user was actually created in the database as well as returned in the response object. So what we're going to do is create a const doc, and we're going to await the find one mongoose method. And you can pass in an object with the search criteria, and so we just want to check the email is the same as the email of that user up there. So we're looking to see if we get that user back. So what we can do is just simply expect doc, and we can use the to be truthy assertion because mongoose will return false if that user can't be found. So that assertion should be adequate. All right, so now that we've done that, I think that test is complete, so let's go ahead and run it and see if it works. There you go, we now have 9 passing tests, so that's good news. Finally, we need some sad path tests so that we can ensure that invalid data doesn't create a new user. So I've gone ahead and created 2 extra tests that I'll explain to you now. So the first one is should not create a user with invalid data. So in this one, we create the post request to users exactly like we did before, only this time what we send is an empty object. And what we'd expect in that case is validation to trigger and a 400 bad request. Now we also check the database in this one, and what we're looking for here is that there are only 2 users in the database, which are the 2 seed users, because we obviously in this case we don't want the database to have created a new user. Now the last test that we need is one to ensure that we don't create a user with a duplicate email address. So the way I've done that one is basically exactly the same as above. There's only one difference here, and instead of sending nothing, I'm actually sending one of the seed user objects in. So obviously that's going to have a duplicate email, so again we're going to expect a 400, and also that no extra user should be in the database.